Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and I'm delighted to have you join us today. The NARM Training Institute is offering a Level 2 NARM therapist training online so that you can attend from anywhere. The trauma field is evolving so quickly. Trauma-informed therapists who want to learn how to address the long-term impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex post-traumatic stress disorder want to be trained in NARM. This online NARM therapist training is starting in July 2021. So if you're interested, we'd encourage you to register now to reserve your spot. For more information and to register, please visit www.narmtraining.com/level2online. We look forward to you joining our growing international NARM community and are inspired to work with you to bring NARM to your clients and communities in order to transform trauma. Welcome, Transforming Trauma listeners. The special conversation we're sharing with you today in this episode features Erin Lewis, a clinical mental health counselor and NARM therapist in Raleigh, North Carolina. Erin specializes in treating dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, and now commonly referred to as DID. In addition, Erin herself has been treated for DID and is committed to promoting education and supporting the needs for traumatized individuals, including those with DID. Her mission is to further the treatment across the U.S. in terms of how we view and treat DID. She's a strong proponent for using NARM in her efforts, and we'll share more about it in this episode. But before we get started, we wanted to offer a thank you gift to all of our Transforming Trauma listeners. To celebrate you and our growing NARM community, we're offering a special 50% discount for our Inner Circle online program through the month of June. The NARM Inner Circle features monthly topic webinars, demonstration videos, the Emotional Completion ebook, access to a private Facebook group, and more. It's an international learning community for anyone who wants to learn more about complex trauma and NARM. And in June, join us to dive deeper into how we apply NARM in working with complex trauma and DID. For those interested, go to www.narmtraining.com/innercircle to sign up with the checkout code June 2021. Offer available until June 30th, 2021. Now let's move on to this important episode on the interplay of complex trauma and dissociative identity disorder. Erin, welcome to Transforming Trauma. How are you?
Good. Hello. How are you doing?
I am filled with anxiety right now, actually. And I mean, it's good to put it out there, right? Instead of pretending that it's not there, let's just invite it to hang out. Just be.
Yeah. Okay. I like that philosophy. I'm feeling a tad on the anxious scale myself, to tell you the truth. A little bit. I got my pup here to help me.
Yeah, we talked offline about a love of dachshunds, so we already know we're going to be great friends today. So before we dig into everything, you know from being a listener of the podcast that we like to ask everyone, what is it that you want listeners to get out of our conversation today?
The biggest thing that I can think of is even beyond learning about like DID or dissociative identity disorder or any of that is just the stigma is so thick, not just among the communities, but like also in the field that we're in. To just sum it up, like to lessen the stigma, it's almost feared among some clinicians, even like some of the better.
Raise his hand. Yeah. Because I don't know what I don't know.
Right. And it's like we're not taught that in grad school either. So you have to like seek it out, and you're already busy with your caseload. You're already busy with like your passions. And then it just seems like this is an issue that kind of gets pushed to the side. So I kind of started this vendetta of squashing the stigma about, I don't know how long ago now, pandemic brain, a while ago. And I think it's because I kept running into psychiatrists that were saying like, I don't believe in DID, but I'll treat them.
What?
I was like, oh, okay.
Right.
So how do you work with somebody like that? Right. Like, but then on the other end, one of the prominent universities in the area, actually, like they teach the DID does not exist.
Where are you?
So I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Okay.
So we have like, we're called the Research Triangle because we have like Duke, UNC, NC State, like these really big universities. It's not well taught. And I was trying to think like, is it well taught in any of them? And I was like, no, honestly. But then I think of my own training in graduate school, and it was just like, this is a thing that can happen sometimes, rarely. And that was
Right.
about all that I was taught about it, to be honest. So squashing the stigma, that's kind of what I'm here.
And I'm super excited about this topic. We've actually had a lot of requests to talk about this topic. And as I said, I raised my hand. This is something I know almost nothing about. So I'm really excited to dig in. But before we do that, would you just give a little intro? Tell the folks who you are and what you do.
Okay, yeah. So I am Erin Lewis. I am a trauma therapist in North Carolina. I just opened up a company not too long ago with my business partner.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Business partner and best friend of like, I don't know, a decade or two or so. I don't know. So I'm feeling pretty good about that. The whole center that we've created, every clinician is trained to work with DID specifically and dissociative disorders. And then we're also the first people, I guess, clinicians in the state that are actually offering DID groups, clinical groups, which, comes with its own challenges, to be honest, but like it's really fulfilling work. So that's kind of what I do, is a lot of trauma therapy. And I also research a lot. I don't do the research, but it's like I compile so much research right now. I'm in a wormhole about DID and possession culturally. Yeah.
That sounds like so much fun to dig into.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing, honestly, because if you read in the DSM, it says like you can't diagnose it if it's cultural possession. And I was like, interesting. How can you tell the difference? So then
you go into the literature. Wow.
Yep. So I read a lot of literature. So it's not the funnest reading, but it is kind of like, I don't know, like I like to get like the feel of what the authors are thinking. Also, like everyone has such a different view of DID. It's more specific now, honestly, on DID than the other dissociative disorders, because it used to be like dissociative amnesia and depersonalization, derealization, et cetera, OSDD, for instance. But really, my research has now been more focused on DID because I get the most requests for it, I think, for consultations. I really like providing clinical consultations because then it's like, they go out to their people and then more people can learn about how to treat it.
Yeah. Well, let's throw out some definitions because I'm guessing already there might be people listening going, what the heck is DID? So what is DID?
So DID is called Dissociative Identity Disorder. It's also formally known as multiple personalities. And that was like back in the day, the name change happened a while ago. But essentially, this is when two or more personalities are in one body. So there's a distinctive change. Some people call it switching. Some people call it changing. And then there's like a definite, like a marked time loss about it. So there's amnestic barriers, not to get too into it. It's kind of hard for me to hold back. But on a surface level, this is somebody who has had an immense amount of trauma and their consciousness essentially has split into other consciousness, right? Like, so they may have 4 or 5 experiences or personalities, right, of one event, for an instance. Whereas somebody else might only have a couple, right? If you go into parts therapy, IFS, love it. For this, it's kind of like parts, but think of it as an extension of PTSD, right? We all have different parts of ourselves. But the more trauma, the more dissociated, the stronger these amnestic barriers get, the stronger the parts. So I just teach people, like, if you can work with PTSD, CPTSD, you can work with DID just fine. But DID is dissociative identity disorder.
Thank you. And as you were saying that, something that just clicked for me, because you were saying, I guess and it's probably not quite this simple, right? Like the more complex or strong, I don't know what the right word is, but the more profound the trauma, the more dissociated a person becomes from it, which then makes sense to me, the difference between a part and another identity, because the further away it is from, probably Dick Schwartz would call the capital S self, is a different part. Am I understanding that right? Or
yeah, I think that you're on understanding perfectly, actually.
Oh, okay.
So what Dick Schwartz says, like, the self, it's really imperative to use the client's language. So sometimes they call themselves the center or like the host, if they've researched it a lot, to be honest.
Is that the clinical term?
So the research is mixed. Just to let you know, there's some real defenders that it doesn't exist, and there's some real defenders that it does, right? Like, I mean, like, that's how mixed this research is.
Can I ask a question about that? Because something I've learned is that who benefits from protecting certain information? So I'm wondering who benefits from DID not existing?
I've thought about that quite a lot. And I think it is about the inability to see that really, truly horrible, horrific things that you would only see in a movie can happen to anyone. It protects all of us to believe that it's not real. Because if you believe that it is, you know it could have happened to your grandma, could have happened to your brother, could have happened to you, maybe is happening to you, right? Like it protects society also on a level to like not see, right? Like what we see with Black Lives Matter right now, it's pulling back that veil of things that like white people haven't wanted to see, right? Like some have, right? But like,
great analogy.
I think it's really about not wanting to see how horrible things can really get for some people. Kind of like when Freud sent out a paper, like his client obviously back in the day, because Freud, right?
Like yesterday, Freud with the what?
Yes. But like, I think it was Anna O.
Oh yeah. Grad school, ding, got it.
Yep. Go on. So he sent out this paper and it was like, oh, sexual abuse happens and incest abuse happens so much more frequently than anyone thinks. The entire community laughed at him essentially. And he actually ended up resending that paper saying, oh, nope, it's just hysteria, right? Which set women back like 100 years or so, but that's fine. Anyways.
Thanks, buddy.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks. Bye.
Yep. So I think when people like me come out here and say, hey, no, this is a real experience. Oh, not to cover up, I have DID. This is also how I got in this wormhole here. Because I was like, nope. Like, you know, something's wrong, right? You just don't know what it is until like you dive deep. And after like, I don't know, a decade of therapy or so, you know, like I'm able to integrate all this knowledge and like my own experience, the research's experience, and then like able to give like a perspective of what the client might be actually going through on the other end. So that's been helpful for like my consultees essentially to hear about a little bit. I didn't even mention it in the very beginning because it's just like, I don't know. It's kind of like when you have anxiety and at first it's like, oh, this is what anxiety is, you know, it's like you have anxiety and this is what the definition is. But then once you have it for a while, it's just like, oh, it's anxiety. Of course it is.
Right. I'd love to ask your permission to ask some questions about your experience. And obviously anything that you are like, I don't want to talk about that. We'll just edit it out. So don't worry about that piece. But at what age did you recognize? Because you said you had this like, I know something's wrong. At what age were you noticing that?
What I noticed was something was wrong probably in middle school because I was like, you know, when you start realizing it's not just you in the world, it's all these other people too.
Right. Yeah. That's the first time I'm like families. I see other families doing things differently too.
Yeah. Yeah. Like things that were normalized in yours necessarily aren't. Right. Like, and you start finding out in middle school because you're comparing. And then I just kept thinking like, why is my stuff more severe? Not in like my stuff is worse, but like clinically, I don't just have anxiety. I'm having like panic attacks, right? Like I can't remember anything happening. So I was just like, this doesn't make sense. And I just remember thinking like, well, no, like I've always been a very large fan of denial. So
I love how gently you say that. I'm just a big fan.
Yeah, just a repeat customer here.
That is cute. I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah, sure. And then I was just like, oh no one's pain is worse than anyone else's pain ever. And I do believe that we all have our own pain, right? Like, but there is definitely different levels of trauma.
Right.
You know, getting yelled at by a teacher publicly is definitely different than like sexual abuse, for instance.
Absolutely.
So, but for me, I was like, nope, we're all in this together. We all are the same. Right. And then it's like, no, on the inside, it's like time is going too fast. Everyone says things fly by, but things like fly by. You know what I mean? It's like, where did this like, I don't know, this week go, this 2 weeks go, this month go, but chronically. And it's like all of a sudden I'm in high school and I'm just like, well, guess I'm in high school, you know, like it's that time loss. I didn't have any words for it at all. And then I got to college and I was like, the last thing I want to be is a therapist. I was like, that's disgusting. And right, because denial was running deep in my veins.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I would have to say that middle school.
Wow. And at what point in your therapy journey did you arrive, or I guess I'd love to hear how you came about the DID diagnosis and what was that like for you finally having a name for something that you had been, you know, feeling this something's wrong for so long?
Yeah. So just a little psycho ed here. Statistically speaking, it takes about anywhere from 5 to 14 years to properly diagnose someone with DID.
How interesting.
Yeah, because a lot of people think it's schizophrenia and it's not, and the meds do not work the
Oh,
same either, is the thing. Because
oh,
different personalities have different metabolisms, right? Like, so then,
wait. I'm shocked by this. And that is so fascinating to me that now I'm like wordless. But so different personalities literally metabolize. So the body chemistry changes. She's
yes.
nodding her head, and I'm floored by this. And now I want to literally know everything. So you and I are going to spend a lot more time together because this is just wow.
Yeah. I also was like, well, this makes so much sense. If you've ever had a client, for instance, that cannot tolerate medicine well, or they have really rare, quote unquote, side effects of things, and they have a large trauma history, like you need to rethink that client probably.
My jaw is on the floor.
The cellular differences that happen, and there are some Harvard studies on this, like a personality could be epileptic or pseudo-epileptic, a personality can be paralyzed or have some paralysis, and it's actually pretty common for some limbs to go completely numb so that you don't feel them at all. And then there's like some can be diabetic, some can, so I have a personality that's allergic to walnuts. That was not fun to find out. I love walnuts, right? Like I'll eat it all day in my banana bread. I'm about it. But if one of them comes out and they eat it, all of a sudden I can't breathe. And so then like I have to completely, there's a lot
We
here,
need
right?
to do it. Honestly, it would be beautiful to do a series, I think. I'm really holding that. I have so much curiosity right now, and I want to be so respectful of your experience. So I'm just trying to like hold back all of these questions, but at the same time knowing that this is your life. For your life to be an intellectual pursuit for me, I don't want that to be offensive in any way. So I'm really trying to like be mindful of that right now.
Well, I really appreciate that, but I call it Marsha Linehaning it, like how she
Yeah.
created DBT, like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, in the hospital, let alone, like amazing, like how much courage and strength that would take, like I'm not,
Mm-hmm.
I don't really want to compare myself to her because then that gives me anxiety because she's like, I don't know. I have a
Right.
lot of respect for how she's come to like those skills that are taught all over the world now. But there's a piece of me that does a personality of me probably, right? But like there's a piece of me that really does feel like somebody has to break the stigma. Somebody has to be asked the questions, not in like a fetish kind of way, right? Like, but just in like an intellectual, like this is what happens. This is clinically what we see. This is what the research supports and shows, because we're really lacking that as a community. And fun fact, like, so DSM numbers, again, a lot of research. So if you look at Shepherd Pratt, they're a really amazing hospital, great with DID, or McLean, they're going to have a little bit different numbers. Like I think Shepherd Pratt is like 1 to 5% or 1 to 3% or so of the population has DID. The DSM says about 1.5% of the population has DID, which is, so if you think of like anorexia, that's 0.6% of the population. Bulimia is, yep. Also, anorexia is kind of harder to diagnose. So I equate it more to bulimia, which is like 1.5% of the population prevalence for women. I think it's like 0.5% for men or so.
That little.
Yeah, but we all know somebody likely that has had an eating disorder. So if you think of that and you can't think of somebody with DID that you know, that's how misunderstood this is, because it's just as prevalent. It's just not being diagnosed. You'll meet clinicians and they'll be like, oh, I only have one case this one time. And it's like, nope. Like if you work in addictions, for sure you've seen DID. So I can guarantee it.
Okay, then let's tell clinicians, what is it that we're missing right now? How would we know that there might be something else going on? You said the lapses of time. What else?
So that's actually what separates OSDD from DID. So OSDD is otherwise specified dissociative disorder.
Okay.
So that's kind of like not necessarily depersonalization, derealization. Maybe they have the dissociative amnesia there, but they're not quite different personalities. So this kind of can look like if you look at a parts model. So I really love IFS for the beginning stages of DID work. Not necessarily the later stages though, anyways, but like I can get into that at a different time. But if you're looking at this, like what's kind of separating it is time loss, right? If they're saying like, oh, people are reporting that I act so differently, like, okay, let's not jump to conclusions. But if they're saying like, I can't remember yesterday, I can't remember the session. How come I can never remember the sessions? It's not just the dissociative feature of PTSD though. It's just, that's why I call it like PTSD extended, right? It's just like, if you go further down the spectrum of trauma disorders, it's like PTSD, and then you have borderline personality, right? And then you have OSDD or derealization, all of that, right? And then we have DID. So it's just like more profound. A lot of people don't see the switches. They can be really subtle, and it's also not meant for people to know is the thing. So it's like, I don't hold it against therapists. It's just, I think what it is an ignorance right now. It's like literally being taught in grad schools, at least I know at one around my area, which is like a super democratic, progressive area at a research institution, that it doesn't exist. So like, even though it's in the DSM, right? Like anyways, not that I subscribe to the DSM fully, right? I don't know. That's a whole different thing, but
right. That's a different podcast episode.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think really it is the ignorance. And I don't think it's the clinician's fault. I think that they've actually been trained to think of it as zebra instead of a horse.
Oh, 100%. I was even trained after I took the personality disorders class. The personality disorders were rare. And then I started working in addiction. It was like, why does everyone have a personality disorder? It seemed, which if I would have been taught trauma up front and how personality disorders develop, I would have understood what I was seeing a little bit better.
Oh yeah. With personality disorders, you don't get taught very well. I didn't get taught very well. It was kind of like, here's your test. You have to know the DSM. And it was like, okay, great, moving on. Right. But then you sit on anxiety and depression for like a semester.
Right.
If we look at like it as a whole, like environment, we think about how far trauma has come. It's really only the last couple of decades or so, maybe like 1 or 2 decades, that it's like now people are quote unquote trauma informed.
Yes.
Right. It's like, yeah. I mean, to spot TID, you need to be a little more than trauma informed, right?
Right.
Like even trauma therapists have trouble, which is like it's 5 to 14 years to diagnose it properly, because it's like this person has anxiety, this person has depression and addiction and this. And it's like, well, do they? Or is that the different personalities?
Whoa. Now I'm thinking of one of my clients who, like, I look at the list of diagnoses and the questions that I had. There was a time where we were like, is this a trauma response? Is this bipolar? All of the things we were trying to sort out. Wow. Oh,
yeah. I've seen clients go through so many different medications, and like, just to be transparent, like I don't take any psychotropic medication. I take Advil in the morning and an allergy pill. There's pollen problems here in the triangle.
You are delightful. I love this.
One of my past clients, I now will not work with psychiatrists who are unwilling to learn about DID, especially if I believe my client. Then there's like a clash, right? Like between me and the psychiatrist.
And who wants that?
Yeah, and it's not good for their treatment either.
Right.
But I was working with one psychiatrist and they were like, well, we're just going to put this client on Seroquel. And I was just like, that's a great antipsychotic, like if that was the issue, but that's not the issue.
So let's tease this out. What's the difference between psychosis, and that would fall under schizophrenia, versus a different personality?
Right. Okay. So that can be a little tricky and interesting though. So we're not talking. Oh yeah. So like I don't see any of my personalities outside my body, for instance, right? There's no hallucination like that. Sometimes it feels like an intuition almost. It's kind of like this, actually. If you're walking in a dark alley at night and you're like, I need to avoid that person, that strong kind of a feeling comes over you a bit, and you definitely avoid that person. That's kind of what it feels like a little bit for like a personality to come on. The intuition is just different. It might be about finance. One of my personalities is all about finance and stock trading and savings accounts, retirement accounts, Roth IRAs, and all that stuff, right? Like, which is not me at all. But for an instance, like when she comes on, I know it because like all of my thoughts are all of a sudden about the stock market, right? Like,
oh, wow.
And what's going on with that. But it's not like, oh, I think people are after me, right? There's no paranoia with it. I'm not like sitting here thinking like, even with my personalities who are like shy because they don't like loud noises. So if you think of NARM and the connection style, oh, that fits me just like beautifully, honestly, obviously. But it's just like that connection style of stimuli is just so loud. So one of my personalities has a real hard time with loud noises or anything like that. So if they come closer, I call it closer, or fronting is what it's called too. Fronting, yeah. If the personality comes more forward in the consciousness.
Okay.
Yeah. So if they get closer to mine, all of a sudden I'll start feeling things that I normally wouldn't. right? Like if, because I like to blare, like Eminem, for instance, I'm like blaring it and I'm just like, yeah, going for it, or Tech Nine. And if she comes near me, it's like everything needs to be turned off immediately because then it produces such anxiety, right? So that's like my internal experience. Now, if I had like psychosis, it might be like, I'm thinking of, so I used to work in Indiana before I moved here, specifically with psychosis. And I thought that was my population that like, but then here I am. DID is the calling anyways, but like.
We always come home, right?
Yeah, exactly. Denial doesn't last forever, folks. Like,
Yep.
So, like if you have somebody who's seeing things outside themselves, that's more along with psychosis. They're hearing people telling them things, like that's a little different. Like I can hear an opinion sometimes, right? Like, because I have co-consciousness with my personalities. So it's not like the time loss isn't like profound like it used to be or anything. Like I know when they're around, someone's trading stocks or whatever. Sorry, the stock market has been booming in Dogecoin lately. So like that's right. That's why I'm like really about that. But I can know and I can usually remember when they're there. But it's not like a psychotic break where it's like all of a sudden I jump through a window because I think that the devil is after me.
Right.
Like there's none of that. It's all like also based on my life historically, like demographically, even my younger parts, like let's say, like an 8-year-old or something, demographically, like they like things that I used to like. They still have my same parents, for instance, right? Like it's not like
interesting.
Yeah, we all have
almost like a sibling.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. Like,
wow.
So, for better and for worse sometimes, right? Like you got to share the consciousness, but the psychosis level, there's not like, any of that paranoid schizophrenia I used to work with like pretty heavily. And it's not like, oh, I think everyone's looking at me and is after me or that everyone hates me. It's just kind of like, oh, this person inside me doesn't like other people, I notice, right? Like, but it's not that I think that people are, does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Yeah, it does to me. Let's hope it does to other people too.
I hope so. Yeah. So I don't see things that aren't there, essentially.
Is there any rhyme or reason to the types of personalities that show up? Like the stock trader, for instance, that's fascinating. And certainly if you'd rather talk about other client experiences, that's amazing too. Like why a stock trader? Why an 8-year-old little girl? Why my other references like United States of Terra, right? Why?
Oh, what a funny show. It doesn't accurately depict DID, but I think it's hilarious. I like it.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about all the pop culture things, but let's do this question first. Like why these different specific personalities?
Oh, yeah. So there's always a rhyme or reason. I think this is partially why I think IFS works so amazing. I think if IFS and NARM just unite a little bit more on some certain things, like I think those are honestly like the basis of what I treat, like how I treat DID.
The combination of NARM and IFS?
Yeah. And also like just interpersonal. I'm an interpersonal therapist by trade. So it's like that relationship really means a lot. Obviously, for any trauma therapist knows this, right? To build security and safety and all the things and lovely and all that. Okay, so why the personalities? For instance, stock trader. I like that. I think she'd like it too if she heard it. But it's like I had a lot of financial insecurity. Ooh, a little small bout of homelessness at one time, way back in the day. It's kind of like once you go to college and like your parents aren't footing the bill anymore, it's like, oh crap. But it's kind of like when you have different personalities and you're not aware of, at the time I was not aware, all of a sudden I'd spend like $400. I have one that's very into clothing, fashion, loves Tyra Banks, right? Like all the things. And
so you can smize like the best of them, I bet.
Oh, I can't tell you how many seasons I've watched. Just interviews with Tyra, like, oh. And anyway, she's great. But, if someone's spending like $400, okay, well, I needed that for rent, right? Like, so somebody has to come and take control of that because I'm not aware of it. I don't know that I'm losing time where that's gone. And then I'd just be like, I must be just horrible with money, but it wasn't me spending it. I'd be like, I never spend anything ever. And then it's like, how can my bank account be nothing? And I'm working 40 hours a week and I'm going to school full time, like college, right? So then I was like, how is this possible? So for instance, like that's why she is really extra super necessary to kind of keep everybody else in line. I'm thinking of another. So this is a good instance of the last follow back to the last question. I do have a part. I'm a spiritual person anyways.
Me too.
Right. Yay. But so I have this part of me that's also very spiritual. Not everyone in here is. So she's very spiritual, but there's not one time that I'm like, I am God. I never think like the grandiose, I don't have any delusions of grandeur or that. Since I'm such a fan of denial, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, oh, I'm insignificant, kind of a pull towards that. But yeah, so like, I think that like it's important. My spirituality is very, very important to me. So that really keeps me grounded in like who I am versus who they are, right? Like, or who we are as a collective, like to get even more.
Oh, I love that. What a beautiful agency-filled way of relating to this experience. Wow. I love that.
Oh yeah. And then how we impact the community. So it's like, I can think like this though, because I've had therapy. And the thing is like, I had a therapist is great, amazing. It did take 6 or so years or something like that to get diagnosed. Like she knew something was different. I knew something was different. Right. But then it was like BPD didn't really match, but it was so much stronger than PTSD. So it was like, why are my symptoms so much more severe? But then it's like, I had a trauma history, but I just didn't realize how big it was. So then it was just like nothing made sense until everything made sense. Right. And then like my first personality actually came out to her and was like, hey, what am I doing here? Kind of a thing, kind of aggressively, honestly, like, what do you want from me? Right.
Wow.
And then it was like, oh, that happened. And she was like, yep. And I was like, that makes sense. And then it was scary. And then it's like, oh my God, I'm so weird. And then it was like, it is scary at first. It's a hard diagnosis to take in because of the stigma.
Absolutely.
But once you live with it for a while, then it's like, why is it so stigmatized, right? Like, so depersonalization, derealization disorder, for instance, in the dissociative disorders, that happens to over half of the United States population.
Can you describe what depersonalization and derealization are?
Essentially, it's like feeling you're not yourself or the world isn't the world. Right. So there's a dissociation or amnestic barrier. So this can happen in times of grief, increased stress, like profound stress sometimes.
Have experienced. Yeah.
Right. And it's like over half of society has experienced this. Is it even a disorder then? You know what I mean? Or is it just a common human experience? So how I really view PTSD, for instance, and CPTSD, which I honestly kind of feel like everything is CPTSD. I don't just see regular.
Right. Who has a single event trauma? I mean, maybe one person has a car accident, but you've likely had some sort of other trauma before then, right?
Yeah. Developmental. So NARM, everyone has developmental trauma. So then it's like, it doesn't make sense to me I see everything as CPTSD, but like, essentially it's just like, that would be a common human experience to have in that stimuli. So it's like, oh, you get robbed. Okay. Like at gunpoint or something. Yeah. You should have a reaction to that, right? Like, in your body, there should be one there that's protecting you. If you don't have one there, that is concerning, more concerning than if you do have one. So I just see it as like, if you have such a profound trauma history, I don't see why DID is looked at so much differently than PTSD, to be honest. Because once you do the intersystem communication, which is just like breaking down amnestic barriers, talking to the other parts, and you get that co-consciousness, it's not really frightening anymore because you know what's going on. You can remember things. Here to break the stigma.
When I was listening to Larry in one of the last postmasters trainings, and he was talking about, I'm thinking about how profound the trauma is. And then, of course, the resilient factors that could mitigate, certain responses. So is DID directly correlated with how profound the trauma is? Is that the end of my question? I believe it is.
So I'm going to give you kind of two different sides of research on here. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm just going to mark out the ones that say it doesn't exist, right? Like, so.
Yeah. We don't like those people.
Yeah. So let's just go in. I think that they're in a threat response, right? Like it's a whole thing. But so if we look at this research, some of it is going to say, hey, 97 or 98%, where they get this number, I am unclear on. I think it's from their literal one study that they've done. And then they make these very big conclusions, right? But like some of them will say like 97, 98% will be because of profound sexual abuse, right? Like some kind of trauma early in childhood, right? If we look at that statistic, though, that leaves the 3% saying that there's not profound trauma.
Right.
But then this research article I'm thinking of right now was saying like prisoners of war, which I consider to be profound trauma, myself.
I'd say. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So like that can create this. I would also argue that that's profound trauma, which then we get into the definition of what counts as profound, because now we're kind of finding big T and little t don't make sense anymore. So then it's like, well, how do you look at trauma? What's profound to you? And I'm wondering, like, what's profound to this person and even their genetics? You know, like if you're born with, we do know that people are born with a certain temperament, not necessarily like smiley or whatever, right? But like you have a short fuse or a long fuse and you're born with that. Like, okay, so if you have an anxiety scale just in your genetics that's low and you're more likely to get PTSD than because of the stimuli, is the same stimuli as profound to one person as another, right? Like, so then we get into individual characteristics here.
That's tough to tease out. And I'm thinking too, the genetic, and I'm putting genetic in quotes only because how much of that is intergenerational trauma?
Yep.
Right?
Oh yeah. There's so many confounding factors.
Right. Oh my gosh. This would be a crazy little decision tree that we would be making here. Wow. I don't even know my next question. Just keep talking because everything you're saying is fascinating to me.
Once you start learning a little bit about DID, it opens up a whole world of like, oh my God, right? Like I didn't know that any of this was how it was, right? Like, so yeah, what I'm kind of thinking is I always tell my consultees, well, I don't really tell them as much as I ask them, like, hey, what's your gut feeling when you're sitting with this client, or what's your gut feeling about this? Because like maybe it is trauma like that's been passed down, right? But maybe it's also something that they don't even know that is trauma, right? Like, oh, my mom used to, scold me every day, right? Like, because in middle school, like all your other kid friends, all their families scold them in the same way. Now it's normalized, and maybe that was actually abusive, right? Like, and they're like, everyone does that. And it's like, I'm sure we've all had that client that's like, oh, that's normal. And it's like, is it? Definitely not. So in some cases it is, but I just like to tell clinicians, like, follow your gut on it. Like, and like to not be afraid of DID, because dissociation is a human experience, a common human experience at that, right? Like you're driving down the road for 200 miles on a road trip and you're bored out of your mind. And now you're thinking of spaghetti while also simultaneously driving the car and you don't remember the last 60 miles.
Right.
Super common.
Spaghetti. I love white spaghetti, but I'm into it.
Yeah. Spaghetti is delicious.
True.
So then it's like, if we more normalize that dissociation is just a part of our culture, right? Yeah. Like it's almost like there's this American kind of view that like we're not affected by possession, for instance, or like these other cultural things that have been around for forever, right? So then it's like, how are we not affected? It's kind of like denial. Like I didn't know that I was being affected, but I was being affected at the same time. And I didn't want to know. That doesn't make me stronger or less vulnerable. It just makes me like ignorant to my own experience.
I'm thinking now that you said possession again of a client that I had once where there was a question of, was there some sort of possession demon sort of situation? I was trying to be like culturally responsive, spiritually responsive. And it turns out it was just drug-induced psychosis, but I didn't even think about DID, right? What if there was some other thing at play that was complicating the case? But I'm just like, oh, there's so much we don't know about this. And I'm so glad that you're talking about it.
Definitely. At first I was like, okay, now I have to become a researcher. And I was like, that's not my personality. It's to stand in a lab and just look at things. But I guess I sit in a room and read things instead. But it's kind of like, how Brene Brown did the thing with shame, right? And it's like, oh, let me do a meta-analysis of these like thousands of articles on what we see in that. I'm doing a similar thing just with DID, right?
That's amazing.
So we're just teasing out like what this is. And it became obviously a journey of what is happening in my mind. Like, why do I have these different consciousness, right? Like, and like, why can some parts of me stock trade, for instance? And yeah, I'm over here and I'm like, I don't freaking know.
Well, let's integrate NARM a little bit into this because I'm curious. You just finished the therapist training, level 2, is that right?
Level 2, yeah.
So how has learning NARM, how have you integrated NARM into, you said you've been kind of marrying NARM and IFS. What does that look like? What has changed for you?
I love NARM and IFS, yes. So NARM, I would be considered kind of like an eclectic. I mean, like I say lots of different things in terms of DID specifically and treating trauma. But there's something really special about NARM, about consent. IFS had it too, just not to the same extent, I felt.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Like, because you have to ask a protector, right? Like, hey, can I talk to this exile part kind of a thing, which is great intersystem communication, works wonderfully, can't promote enough. But like over here with NARM, there's like this deep, profound respect in that contract. And at first I was like, okay, this is the contract. The contract is a lot harder to learn than you think it is. And then,
and we'll just tell folks who don't know what that is. Essentially, that's the question we ask at the beginning of the episode. What would you like for listeners to get out of it today? In the therapy session is, what's your greatest heart's desire? What would you like for yourself today? That's the contract.
Yep. And then at the very end of the contract, you always ask, this is what you'd like to work on, whatever permission statement, consent statement that you're going to do.
Right.
That was pivotal, like to me, to learn, because then everything made so much more sense. And it seems so small, but really we're violating that. At least I was violating that as a therapist on a daily basis, because I would be like, okay, this is clinically, I can see we need to work on boundaries, right? Like, or something. They'd be like, okay, let's work on that today. But really it wouldn't be a soulful kind of spiritual contract. It wouldn't be like an actual consent. It would be like them people pleasing me. And then it's like, that's not actually consent. Now I'm just an oppressor. And then we get an argument, maybe it would go well, but there would be no change, right? Like, so there is this deep, profound respect that comes with NARM. And I think, honestly, it's like that consent statement means everything. And it seems like so obvious, but until you look at it kind of through that lens of like, oh, I wonder how many times they got consent from their parents. Probably very little, or other therapists. And, you know, then it's like, now we're just going around in a circle of trauma, or following their strategies. Maybe they're following our strategies, either or. Like, we're not actually moving where they're going to want to go. We're just stuck with them. So at least they're not alone, right? Like, so that's great. But at the same time, it's not necessarily helpful to them. So I think with DID, some personalities, they don't want to be seen. So like in my clients, you know, once you spot it once, you can spot it a mile away kind of a thing. Also, once you start to be able to spot DID, you will spot it so much more quickly. And then you'll start seeing it so many more places. And then it gets kind of irritating because you'll talk to that clinician and be like, hey, have you thought of this? And they'll be like, no. And it's like, oh my God, you need to learn something, right? Like, but I see the ignorance kind of shield, but NARM, the survival strategies are helpful, not in terms of classifying clients, just in terms of like, oh, this could happen, right? Like if you go through trauma in this way. Also, like that level 2 training focuses a whole lot on countertransference. And I think that has helped me with specifically clients with DID. That and the consent has helped more. I can't even like quantify it, honestly. It's just helped so incredibly much, right? Like, NARM. I just love NARM.
Oh, that was the sweetest sigh. I love that. And if I may make a reflection on what I'm experiencing today, one of the things we talk a lot about in NARM is identifications and how sometimes we can get so over-identified with our diagnosis that we get stuck in a rut with that, right? And what I hear you doing with the diagnosis for yourself and for others is it's a framework. It's a piece of information with which to kind of construct an idea, but then you go in and get consent with each person. And I'm imagining that, I hope I'm kind of hearing that might be what you do for yourself too, is get that consent.
Oh yeah. I mean, especially when you, as living with a person with DID, when you got other personalities and you're a therapist, oh God, like the time that you can have just alone, right? Like, but it's kind of like, you know, we obviously had to set up those boundaries.
You and the part?
Oh yeah, me and my others essentially, right? Like, because like I'm the only one who went to grad school. I'm the only therapist here, right? Like,
hey, now that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
I love that.
So then it's like they didn't go. I went, therefore I am the only one in sessions with clients, for instance. Like they're not allowed. There's like a wall there, essentially.
I didn't even think about that. What if a personality were to come forward in a session? We have to do this again. There's just way too much more to talk about. Wow.
Once you scratch the surface, all of a sudden it's like, right? Like there is a lot.
Where can folks find you and learn more about this incredible work you're doing?
Oh, yeah. So my business partner, Natalie Struck, actually, she does EMDR and also treats DID as well. And we are called NC, Cutting Edge Counseling. So nccuttingedgecounseling.com. That's where you can get our information. And for consultants, I do not talk to clients out of state because it's against my board rules. I'll talk to any therapist in any country, out of state, it doesn't matter. But at this time, I'm not able to like coach clients, so to say. So yeah, you find us at ncuttingedgecounseling.com.
Wonderful. Well, this has been a joy to speak with you. I'm so excited. Like I feel an expansion happening right now, just in like, you've really educated me, and I can't wait to follow your career and see what you do.
Thanks. And I'm glad that, like you're not afraid of it, because some people are like DID, oh, right. You seem to be open, which is really nice.
Well, I think probably being an addiction therapist helps, because most therapists are afraid of addiction. So I've already gone that far. Might as well keep going, right? Well, and I mean, you've really got me thinking who that I've worked with in the past may have been dealing with this, and I had zero idea. So I need to hire you for a consultation to kind of figure out what are those pieces that I might not have been picking up so that I can begin to see in the future.
Oh, yeah. I'm 100% positive you've treated probably quite a few.
I believe you.
It crosses over with addictions pretty heavily, and eating disorders as well.
Right. Well, all that is born out of trauma, so that all makes sense.
Yep.
Well, Erin, thank you. Thank you for everything, for this today, and for all the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me on and being open and listening. And yeah, I don't know. You have a really soothing voice. It was nice. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's the microphone voice.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all for listening to this important topic on the interplay of complex trauma and dissociative identity disorder. If you're interested in learning more, we invite you to consider joining the NARM Inner Circle online program, where we'll be featuring a series of recorded therapy sessions demonstrating how NARM supports individuals with DID. Each month, the Inner Circle NARM faculty guides you through a step-by-step process of learning how to integrate trauma-informed, NARM-inspired perspective into your work. The intention is to pull up the hood in describing how NARM is being used with real clients to resolve complex trauma. In addition to these monthly NARM demonstrations, faculty host monthly topic webinars. These webinars deconstruct various elements of complex trauma from a NARM perspective. Whether you're already familiar with NARM or just learning about it, there's a place for you within the NARM Inner Circle community. Through the month of June, our Transforming Trauma listeners will receive 50% off of an annual membership if you use the discount code JUNE2021 at checkout. Go to narmtraining.com/innercircle to sign up and for more information. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.